Blood splattered on the car window, each dark red drop falling slowly as if time itself had come to a standstill. Malik Thompson slumped in his seat, his hands clutching his head, his screams drowned out by the raspy laughter of Vanessa Cole. "Shut up, or I'll shoot." The gun in her hand was aimed directly at him, her eyes flashing with the madness of someone who knew they held the power of life and death. That night, the empty street became a battleground where justice was crushed under the heel of a female cop who had forgotten her oath. But would the footage from the body cam be enough to bring down her web of lies? Would Vanessa pay the price? Or would Malik forever remain a forgotten victim? Sign up now to not miss the thrilling developments of this fateful trial. The headlights from Vanessa's patrol car sliced through the darkness, cutting through the night like a blade. The piercing beam of light hit Malik Thompson square in the face, casting a cold, stark glow that illuminated every weary line on his face. Malik had just clocked out, his body worn and aching after another grueling day of labor. But his mind had found solace in thoughts of home. A warm bowl of soup, fragrant white rice, the quiet comfort of his mother's presence. That was all he could think about as he drove. The idea of sitting down to a meal, letting the warmth of home wash over him, was the kind of peace that kept him going through the long, exhausting hours. For a brief moment, he forgot the weight of the world and the grind of his daily life. But that fragile peace was shattered in an instant. The siren screamed through the stillness, so sharp and jarring it felt like it was tearing into his very soul. His heart raced, not because he had done anything wrong, but because deep down, he knew. With his black skin, he didn't need to make a mistake to be stopped. He didn't even need to break the law. The police were always there, lurking, ready to impose their own form of justice. Malik's pulse quickened, a feeling of dread creeping into his chest. He had felt it before, that gnawing unease, the unmistakable sense that something was wrong even when he hadn't done anything. It was a feeling that had lived inside him for years, a constant companion. As the siren continued to wail, Malik's mind flashed to memories from his childhood, to the endless stream of encounters with authority figures who saw him not as a person but as a threat. Every interaction, every glance that lingered too long, every question that didn't make sense, it all came flooding back. He was used to this fear. But tonight, it felt sharper, heavier, more suffocating than ever. The patrol car came to a screeching halt behind him, its headlights still blinding in the rearview mirror. Malik's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as his mind raced. This wasn't just a stop. This was something more, something darker. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. His breath hitched, his throat dry, as the weight of inevitability pressed down on him. He wasn't just a man on his way home. Tonight, he was a target, and no matter how much he tried to shake the feeling, he knew that in a moment, everything would change. Vanessa Cole stepped out of the car with a sharp, authoritative stride. Her boots clicked against the pavement, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. Every step was calculated, deliberate, exuding the cold, unyielding power of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Malik's eyes locked onto her as she approached. There was no warmth in her gaze, no curiosity, no understanding, just the cold, indifferent stare of someone who saw him not as a human being, but as an obstacle to be dealt with. No good evening. No, why are you stopped here? Just a look, cold and dismissive. She didn't need to ask. She already knew everything she needed to know. Vanessa's hand was already resting on the gun holstered at her side as she neared his car. He didn't have to see her pull it out to know it was coming. He could feel it in the air, the heavy weight of authority that hung between them. She was ready to make a move, but Malik didn't know how to react. He sat frozen, his body tense, his mind racing as the cold steel of reality pressed against him like an iron fist. The door to his car was yanked open with a violent pull. The sound of metal crashing against metal was deafening, and Malik flinched, his body jerking in instinctive response. His heart pounded, the thudding of his pulse drowning out all other noise. He wasn't afraid because of the confrontation. He was afraid because, in that moment, he knew the rules didn't apply to him. There was no shield of fairness, no safety net of the law that would protect him now. Not in this moment, not with her standing over him, as gleaming with the power she wielded so casually. He felt utterly exposed. His breath was shallow, his chest tight as if the very air had become too thick to breathe. This was the kind of moment he had always dreaded, the kind of moment that had haunted him throughout his life. A moment when everything could change in an instant, when a simple traffic stop could spiral into something far darker. Vanessa didn't say a word, but her eyes spoke volumes. They were cold, calculating, and devoid of empathy. He was nothing more than a nuisance, a problem that needed to be dealt with. She didn't need to ask questions or understand his side of the story. She had already made up her mind. Malik felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew what came next. The questions, the demands, the threat of violence hanging over his head. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about power. And in this moment, Vanessa had it all. Malik's entire body tensed as he awaited the inevitable. But no matter how much he braced himself, he couldn't prepare for the cold reality of what was about to unfold. Then, like a thunderclap, her voice cut through the silence, sharp and venomous. "Shut up, or I'll shoot," she snarled, her gun leveled at his chest, her finger hovering over the trigger. Her words were not a threat. They were a promise, delivered with the conviction of someone who knew she had the power to carry out every word. Her gaze, devoid of any humanity, gleamed with the madness of someone who had lost touch with everything that once made her human. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no flicker of doubt, only the cold certainty of someone who had already made up her mind. And in that moment, as the gun pointed directly at him, Malik's heart stopped. It wasn't the sight of the weapon that terrified him. It was the person holding it. It was the realization that the very system that was meant to protect him had become the very instrument of his demise. Malik's breath hitched, his body trembling not from fear of the gun, but from the overwhelming weight of a truth he had long feared. He wasn't just a man being confronted by a cop. He was a black man standing in front of a woman who was empowered by a system that had never truly seen him as equal. He had been here before, many times. He had been stopped, questioned, humiliated, but never had it felt this suffocating, this life-threatening. He wasn't just a suspect in her eyes. He was a threat simply because of the color of his skin. Vanessa moved with terrifying speed, slamming his arm down on the dashboard with force, making the metal of the car groan in protest. The impact was so hard that blood splattered across the windshield in quick, violent streaks, marking the glass with vivid red. The world seemed to freeze for a split second as the reality of the situation hit him. There was no escape. There was no help coming. She was the law in this moment, and nothing and no one could stop her. The sound of Vanessa's laughter filled the air, rough and hollow. It wasn't just the sound of a woman enjoying power. It was the sound of a woman who had long abandoned any sense of empathy or conscience. Her laughter echoed through the night, cutting into the silence like a blade. Malik's breath grew shallow as the fear clawed at his chest. But it wasn't just the fear of dying that consumed him. It was the fear of being utterly powerless, of being at the mercy of someone who had crossed the line from authority to madness. In that moment, the pain of his injuries, the blood pooling on the dashboard, was nothing compared to the suffocating realization that the very thing that was supposed to protect him, the badge she wore, was the instrument of his undoing. Her uniform, once a symbol of justice and protection, now felt like nothing more than a grotesque costume, a thin veneer that hid the truth beneath. She was no longer a police officer. She was an executioner. And the law no longer existed in this moment. The words of justice had long been drowned out by the sound of her twisted laughter. There was no one here to stop her, no one to challenge her. She was judge, jury, and executioner in this nightmarish scene. And the system that had once promised to protect Malik had turned its back on him. With every passing second, Malik felt himself slipping further and further away from any hope of salvation. His chest tightened, his throat constricted, and every ounce of strength seemed to drain from his body. He could feel the weight of his life hanging in the balance, held by a woman who had long ago abandoned any sense of moral restraint. There was no savior coming, no knight in shining armor, no hero to intervene. There was only Vanessa. And in this moment, she was the law, the system, and the fate that had already been sealed. The truth settled over Malik like a suffocating weight. In this moment, his life didn't matter. He was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the system was never designed to protect him. It was only designed to crush him. And as the seconds ticked by, his world shrank to the barrel of the gun aimed squarely at his chest, the laughter of the woman who held his life in her hands ringing in his ears in the cold, suffocating realization that nothing he could do would change his fate. The deserted road seemed to freeze in time, transforming into a darkened arena where justice was suffocated beneath the weight of Vanessa's power. The stillness of the night, once peaceful and serene, now felt heavy and oppressive, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of injustice. Malik, a young man who had once harbored simple dreams of a quiet, peaceful life, was now reduced to nothing more than prey in a game of power that Vanessa had orchestrated. With a gun in her hand and eyes that gleamed with cruelty, she had already determined his fate. In the blink of an eye, his world had shifted from hope to terror, from the possibility of a peaceful evening to the inevitability of fear. The road, once an ordinary stretch of pavement leading him home, had become a battleground where he fought not for his life, but for his very humanity. As Vanessa advanced, her every step was calculated, cold, and deliberate. The road was no longer just a place of passage. It had become a dark stage for a brutal performance of dominance. She wasn't just a police officer. She had become something far more sinister, a figure who saw herself above the law, who wielded power not for protection but for destruction. With each movement, she erased the lines between law and lawlessness, making her actions as much about cruelty as they were about control. And yet, amidst the chaos of that moment, something small, unnoticed by Vanessa, became the silent witness to everything that transpired. Her body camera, once a simple tool for recording and oversight, had inadvertently become the one thing she hadn't accounted for. The unblinking eye that captured not just her actions, but the very essence of the crime she was committing. In her haste, Vanessa had forgotten to turn it off, unaware that every movement she made, every word she spoke, was being recorded. The camera didn't just capture the force of her brutality. It captured the tremble in Malik's hands, the terror in his eyes, the sweat that dripped down his face like the first drops of a storm. The camera recorded the sound of his breath growing more desperate, more erratic, the rhythm of a heart that had once beaten with hope but now thudded with dread. And amidst this, the camera also preserved something Vanessa hadn't considered, a fragment of truth, an undeniable piece of evidence that even she could not erase. The scene around them was filled with darkness, but the camera turned it into something different. The quiet wind that rustled through the trees seemed to echo Malik's fear. The night's silence, now broken by the unrelenting pressure of power, a power Vanessa wielded without mercy. The sounds of her laughter, cold and detached, were like a knife to his heart, the thud of the gun being aimed at him, the screeching of metal as she slammed his hand down on the dashboard. All these moments, every cruel action, were now etched in digital stone. The camera had captured everything, even the smallest details, the hopelessness in Malik's eyes, the final flicker of resistance before it was stamped out. And in this, there was a whisper of justice. A whisper that came not from a courtroom or from the law, but from a small piece of technology that had been forgotten. It was a reminder that even when power is misused and humanity is forgotten, justice can still be found, not in the loud cries for reform, but in the quiet, undeniable truth that technology had captured in a moment of human suffering. Vanessa had thought she was untouchable. She believed the law had become a tool for her to control, to enforce her will without consequence. But the camera, unnoticed and unacknowledged, had silently preserved everything she had tried to hide. It didn't just record her brutality. It recorded the fear, the pain, the humanity of Malik, something she had stripped away in her pursuit of power. That camera, a simple silent witness, had become the guardian of a truth that would one day rise to challenge the lies and the power that Vanessa had thought she controlled. As the minutes stretched on, Malik could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The air was thick with fear, with a sense that nothing he could do would change the course of what was happening. He had been reduced to nothing more than an object in this twisted game, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. And yet, despite all the fear, despite the overwhelming sense of hopelessness, there was still a flicker of something else. Something small but undeniable. The truth. It was there in the footage, in the quiet click of the camera's lens, in the small, silent act of resistance that would one day be his voice when he could no longer speak. This wasn't the end for Malik. This was just the beginning. The road, the power, the brutality, it would all come to an end. But not in the way Vanessa thought. The truth had been recorded, and it would not be silenced. It would be heard, and it would be seen. And no matter how much Vanessa tried to bury it, it would rise from the ashes of this dark moment like a phoenix, bringing justice where it had once been crushed beneath her heel. The gavel of Judge Lydia slammed down like thunder, reverberating through the still air of the courtroom. The room fell silent, every eye locked on Lydia, standing behind her imposing wooden bench. Her sharp gaze cut through the thick atmosphere, officially setting the gears of justice in motion. The golden light from the room bathed her face, highlighting the stern lines of her expression, her eyes dark and unblinking, seeming to suggest that nothing within this room could escape her control. Vanessa entered the room with her back straight, her broad shoulders like iron. Her haughty gaze swept across the faces of everyone present as if she had faced these people thousands of times before. Her golden hair cascaded down in waves, shimmering like a halo, while her every step exuded confidence. Each stride echoed powerfully as if she were stepping onto a stage she had already mastered, the star of a performance she had perfected over and over. There was no hint of nervousness, no trace of fear or uncertainty. To her, this trial was nothing more than another play, one she had rehearsed countless times. Lydia's eyes remained fixed on Vanessa. Though her face remained cold and impassive, deep within her, a fire of fury smoldered. Fury fueled by years of witnessing countless injustices. Every time she gazed at Vanessa, she couldn't help but remember those who thought their power could conceal the truth, those who acted with contempt for justice, oblivious to the fact that justice would ultimately speak for itself. When Vanessa stopped in front of the bench, Lydia didn't speak immediately. She grasped the edge of the table, her fingers tightening so forcefully that the knuckles stood out in sharp relief. The silence in the room stretched like a taut string, every second drawn out. Lydia stared at her, not only with cold eyes, but with the unwavering resolve of someone who had fought a lifetime for fairness. Finally, Lydia spoke, her voice booming across the room. "Are you ready, Miss Cole?" The question was not just a request. It carried within it a blaze of rage, a seething frustration born from years of witnessing unaddressed wrongs. It was an inquiry that could not be answered, a challenge to all those who had exploited power to desecrate justice. Lydia's voice didn't sound like that of a judge. It carried the hard, unyielding tone of a warrior, someone who was prepared to face any obstacle. The courtroom was dead silent, the air heavy with tension, and everyone in the room could feel the force behind her words. Vanessa smirked, her cold blue eyes flashing with unchecked arrogance. "I have nothing to fear, Your Honor. I'm just doing my job," she said, her tone nonchalant and self-satisfied, as though everything around her was beneath her concern. Her words sliced through the air like sharp blades, cutting into the audience, those who had once shuddered in fear whenever they saw her on the streets. They remembered the times when they stood before the glare of the patrol car lights, watching her step out with a proud gaze, wielding invisible power that no one dared challenge. Vanessa had always been the one who could turn any situation to her favor, the one who always won in the power game she played. And now, here she stood in front of a courtroom, still unafraid, still holding on to that same arrogant self-image. She folded her arms, lifting her chin high as if nothing in this world could shake her confidence. Her shining golden hair swirled lightly with each movement, creating a false halo around her, making her look like a queen on her throne, oblivious to the people around her. Her eyes scanned the room, sensing a mixture of fear and admiration in every gaze. She knew who she was, and no one could stop her. But Lydia, standing across from her, did not immediately respond. She remained silent, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the table, her gaze as sharp as a razor, unwavering and unblinking. The entire room seemed to be cloaked in a thick fog, the silence so oppressive it felt suffocating. Lydia didn't rush to reply to Vanessa's provocation. Instead, she quietly observed, like a seasoned hunter tracking her prey. She didn't need to speak much, didn't need to rush. Lydia's silence was her strategy, a calculated move. She knew her prey would eventually dig her own hole, would reveal her weakness, and when that moment came, there would be no one who could save Vanessa. Lydia's gaze sliced through each word Vanessa uttered, but she did not retaliate hastily. She simply waited, biding her time for the moment when Vanessa would expose her true face. The arrogance she displayed was nothing more than a fragile facade, and Lydia knew that within this shell, there were cracks that, with just the slightest touch, would shatter completely. The courtroom erupted into a chorus of murmurs, like the crashing waves of a storm, relentless and uncontainable. The tension in the air, thick and heavy, suddenly boiled over. A woman from the front row shouted out, her voice filled with outrage. "She's lying." Her accusation ignited the crowd, fueling the embers of anger that had been simmering in silence. Activists, those who had fought for justice, began raising banners high, emblazoned with slogans like "Justice for Malik" and "End Police Brutality." Their eyes burned with a fierce fire, filled with both rage and hope, as though they were prepared to fight relentlessly, no matter the cost. Across the courtroom, the sound of heavy breaths and whispered words filled every corner, a swelling wave of frustration rising uncontrollably. In the front row, Elelainer, Malik's mother, sat clutching her handkerchief, her eyes red from the tears that had long since dried up. She looked at her son, now seated in the witness stand, once a young man full of hope and belief in life. But now, Malik was a mere shadow of himself, a vibrant young man reduced to the victim of an unjust system. The sight of him there, so broken, twisted her heart with a pain so raw it felt as though it was tearing her apart. She knew that what was unfolding in this courtroom was not just Malik's fight. It was the fight of an entire community, the fight of all those who had been subjected to violence, discrimination, and the consequences of a society that remained indifferent. The tension in the courtroom spread like a quiet fire. Every word spoken, every action taken, feeding the flames. Every eye turned toward Lydia, as if searching for a sign, a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail, or if this was just another game of power, one that people like Vanessa had manipulated for far too long. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as the door swung open and Marissa Evans strode in, every step exuding strength and resolve. Her posture was unyielding, confident. She walked without hesitation, each movement deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. Her long black hair was neatly styled, yet it was her cold, determined gaze and the lines of unwavering resolve etched across her face that captured the full attention of everyone present. As she ascended to the prosecutor's podium, she held a video in her hand, not simply a piece of evidence, but a weapon in its own right, sharp and powerful, ready to cut through the web of lies threatening to suffocate justice. I'm here for Malik, for his mother, and for those who no longer have a voice. Marissa's voice resonated deep and forceful, breaking the heavy silence in the room like thunder rolling through a storm. Each word she spoke felt like a battle cry, not just aimed at Vanessa, but at an entire system that had allowed injustice to thrive unchecked. The courtroom light shone on her, illuminating the fierce determination in her eyes, in her stance, as if she had been preparing for this fight for far longer than anyone could have known. Marissa was not just a prosecutor. She was a woman shaped by her own deep personal scars, a pain that had never faded, a wound in her soul that time had not healed. She spoke of her brother, beaten by the police in a case that was all too personal. It was not a distant incident. It was a memory that had been burned into her very being, a memory that haunted her every day. My brother, she continued, her fist clenched tightly, was beaten for no reason. And even though there was clear evidence, no one stood up for him. That's why I can't turn my back on this case. Because I understand. I feel what Malik is going through. In her voice was a grit, a perseverance born of long-standing wounds that had never healed. Now, she fought not only for Malik's justice, but for all those who had been silenced, for all the victims who had been ignored by the system. The emotions in the room surged as Marissa's words settled into the air, each sentence thick with power and determination. The audience could feel it, the undeniable truth. Marissa Evans was not just fighting for one case. She was fighting for every victim, every person this system had failed, and every voice that had been suppressed. Her resolve was not merely an act. It was a declaration. She was not just standing in a courtroom. She was standing for all of those who had never been given the chance to stand up for themselves. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew that this was a battle that would not end quietly. It was a fight that would echo far beyond the courtroom walls. Malik had once been a 24-year-old man with a warm smile and eyes that shone with hope. He worked at an auto repair garage, where each day he honed his skills on old, battered cars, finding joy in the hands-on nature of his work. He wasn't wealthy, nor did he come from a privileged family, but he held on to a big dream, a firm belief in a brighter future. Malik dreamed of one day opening his own shop, a place where he could freely express his skills, control his own life, and not rely on anyone else. He clearly remembered the night spent beside Elelainer, his mother, in the dim light of their old kitchen. The two of them had only each other, but they never lacked love. Malik often promised his mother, "I'll make you proud." Those words were not just encouragement from a son to his mother. They were a commitment to himself about a future full of hope. He wanted to give his mother a better life, to take away the worry about tomorrow. Those were the most beautiful dreams of his life, dreams built on hard work and perseverance. But now, those dreams had been tainted, shattered irreparably by the memories of that night. The night Vanessa, a symbol of injustice and oppression, crushed him. He remembered every detail as if it had just happened. That night, when he stopped his car on a familiar road, there were no signs that anything bad would happen. But in the blink of an eye, his peace was torn apart by the sound of a police siren. And in just a few minutes, everything in his life changed. Officer Vanessa approached, her headlights blinding him. And before he could process what was happening, she had pinned him to the ground. Vanessa's knee pressed hard into his back, pain radiating through his body, the sensation of suffocation leaving him unable to move. That feeling not only choked him physically, but it also crushed all the hopes and dreams he had nurtured. That night took from him not only his freedom, but also his future, his belief in a fair life. Now, whenever he thought back to that night, all he saw was darkness and despair. His dream of owning an auto shop, of a simple and happy life, now felt like a distant memory, buried under the weight of pain and injustice. Malik's memories of his childhood were forever haunted by the image of his father being dragged away by the police simply for looking suspicious. When Malik was just 10 years old, he hid behind the curtains in their small home, his wide eyes witnessing his father being pulled out without any explanation, no reason other than the disdainful glances of the officer. His father had done nothing wrong, yet he was treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin, simply because of the suspicion in the eyes of those who were supposed to protect them. The sound of Ella Laner's crying, his mother's grief-stricken sobs, still echoed in Malik's mind. Every time he recalled that night, those cries seemed to tear at his heart. His mother, a strong woman, couldn't do anything to protect his father, and that painful memory was one he could never forget. Now, standing in this courtroom, Malik saw himself as the victim of the very injustice he had witnessed as a child. The fear he once experienced as a vague childhood memory had now become a vivid reality, suffocating every breath he took. That feeling of helplessness and fear because he couldn't change the truth was a constant presence in his mind. Every time he stepped outside, he felt like he was being watched, as though the police or anyone with power could impose fear on his life at any moment. His childhood had scarred him deeply, and now those scars had turned into permanent wounds, ones that would never heal. Since that incident, Ella Laner had not known a peaceful night's sleep. Every evening, she would sit in the dark room, clutching Malik's shirt to her chest as though it was the only way she could feel close to her son. The familiar scent of the shirt, the soft threads between her fingers, were the only remnants of the son she had raised, the boy full of hope. In the darkness of the room, Ella Laner whispered to herself, her lips mumbling, "I told you to be careful." But now, those words of caution were no longer enough to protect Malik. She knew no matter how hard she tried to shield him, he would still face an unfair society, a system that would always treat them like outsiders. Eleanor's pain wasn't just that of a mother losing her sense of security for her child. It was the pain shared by millions of mothers around the world. These mothers had to watch their children face discrimination, violence, and indifference from those in power. Malik could feel the despair in his mother's eyes, the constant worry that never seemed to fade. That evening, when Malik called his best friend, his voice cracked with emotion, unable to continue. "I don't recognize myself anymore," he sighed, his words drowning in deep sorrow. He was no longer the Malik before, the young man with dreams of a bright future, the son with a desire to make his mother proud. Now, he had lost not only that dream but also himself in a society that would never accept difference, that would never recognize equality. The pain he felt, and the pain his mother felt, had now become an inseparable part of their lives, a part of millions of untold stories. Marissa stood resolutely at the prosecutor's podium, her fingers delicately resting on the remote control as if preparing to ignite an inevitable chain of events that could not be undone. The air in the courtroom seemed to tighten, as if everyone instinctively understood the gravity of the moment. With a steady hand, she pressed the button, and the screen flickered to life before the clear, painful truth emerged. For a brief moment, the image wavered, but it soon stabilized, revealing a scene that was seared into the memories of Malik and every person present in the room. The footage was shaky, yet every agonizing detail was visible. Vanessa, with her cold, emotionless expression, her voice harsh and commanding, yelling "Shut up." As Malik, desperate and vulnerable, raised his hands in a gesture of pleading, his eyes were wide with confusion, fear evident in every inch of his face as he tried to speak, to explain, but words failed him. His voice caught in his throat. Vanessa's laughter rang through the video, cruel and guttural. Not a laugh of amusement, but one filled with contempt. A laugh that pierced the air like a blade. It filled the room, drowning out the sound of Malik's anguished cry as he collapsed to the ground, blood trickling from his nose in small, dark rivers. The camera captured every moment, every painful breath, every drop of blood. The image, though small in the frame, was a monumental symbol of everything that had gone wrong, everything that had been warped in a system meant to protect. It was not just one isolated incident from a tragic night, but a raw, undeniable embodiment of the injustice Malik and so many others had been subjected to. This moment, this brutal act, was now their truth, their constant fight. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. For a few precious seconds, no one moved. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. The weight of the truth hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating those present, making the room feel smaller, the walls pressing in. As the realization settled, the footage spoke louder than any words could. Then, almost like a wave breaking over a dam, the stillness shattered. A roar of outrage erupted from the crowd, a chorus of voices crying out in fury, disbelief, and anguish. The people who had watched this unfold, activists, family members, those who had lived through their own struggles, could not sit silently any longer. They were incensed. They shouted, their voices rising in unison, condemning the brutality they had just witnessed. The anger was no longer just an abstract feeling. It was a force, an uncontrollable swell of emotion that surged through the room. People stood, gesturing toward Vanessa, pointing fingers, shouting their disgust, their outrage. The energy in the room was a storm, fierce, uncontrollable, like a tide crashing against the walls of injustice. But Vanessa, standing at the center of it all, remained unerringly composed. Her face had gone pale, drained of color, but her body remained poised, her stance still unfazed. She didn't flinch. She didn't show any sign of fear or regret. She stood there with her arms folded, almost as if she was waiting for the storm to pass. Her calm was chilling, a cold, calculated defense against the chaos she had stirred. The crowd's fury rolled over her like waves crashing against a cliff, but she remained unbroken. She acted as though she was still in control, as though the truth on the screen hadn't changed the course of the room's emotions or shattered the facade she had worked so hard to maintain. Yet, for those who watched closely, there was something more. Something that was slipping through her ironclad demeanor. The cracks in her control were beginning to show. Tiny fissures that, with each passing second, grew wider. The stillness of her body couldn't mask the subtle tension in her face. The faint trembling of her jaw, the slightest flicker in her eyes. Those small, almost imperceptible signs revealed that everything was not as it seemed. The calmness she projected was now clearly strained, the layers of self-assurance crumbling beneath the weight of the truth that had just been laid bare. It was a crack in her armor, one that would only grow larger as the moments passed. The room was filled with a charged, electric silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The audience was watching, waiting, knowing that this was the moment where everything could change. They were no longer just spectators. They were participants in a fight that had been too long in the making. Every eye was on Vanessa now, and as her facade began to crack, so did the illusion of control she had held over them all. The game was no longer hers to play. Tina, a bystander, stood at the witness stand, her hand trembling as she grasped the microphone. Every movement she made was filled with anxiety, as though she was about to be swept away by a violent tide. She glanced around the courtroom for a moment, feeling as though every pair of eyes was fixed on her, their gaze full of expectation and concern. A single tear, impossible to hold back, fell down her cheek as she began to recount what she had witnessed. Her voice quivered, yet her determination was evident in every word. "I saw her hit him," Tina began, her voice catching in her throat. Even though he did nothing, she choked back a sob. The painful images of that night, still vivid in her mind. She couldn't forget the desperate look in Malik's eyes, his hands raised in a plea as Vanessa used her power without hesitation to overpower him. He didn't do anything wrong. He was just standing there, and she attacked him. Tina's voice cracked once again, unable to stay steady, as if the pain she had witnessed was tearing her apart. "I called other officers," Tina continued, her words soaked with sorrow and helplessness, "but no one came. No one helped. I didn't know what to do." Her voice broke, and the tears flowed freely, unstoppable. She lowered her head slightly, as though the weight of the memories was too much for a person to bear. What made the audience's hearts ache wasn't just her testimony, but the overwhelming sense of powerlessness, the despair that Tina and all the other witnesses had to endure. They saw the injustice. They knew what was happening was wrong, but the system failed them. No one came to help. This wasn't just the negligence of one officer. It was a deep, systemic failure that left the people feeling abandoned, voiceless. This small yet profoundly painful moment, an ordinary citizen's inability to help another, was part of a larger story that no one could ignore. The helplessness of one individual standing alone against an unjust system became the painful truth for everyone who witnessed. Sergeant James Carter stood at the witness stand, his voice rough, not from nerves, but from the exhaustion of a man who had witnessed too much injustice without being able to change anything. He sighed deeply, raising his head to look directly at the crowd, his gaze unwavering. As a police officer for many years, he had faced countless difficult cases. But this case, and what he was about to say, was something he never imagined he would have to confront. Vanessa has been investigated 3 times, Carter began, his voice low but strong. But all the charges were swept under the rug thanks to her connections. He paused for a moment, his eyes filled with disappointment and helplessness. These words weren't just about one individual. They were a damning truth about the very system he had spent his career serving. The police, the people entrusted with upholding justice, were now bound by power dynamics and relationships they couldn't fight against. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, as though the air itself had been squeezed out. Carter's words were a shock, yet it was a shock that everyone in the room had been expecting, an undeniable truth that had always lingered beneath the surface now being acknowledged. "We want to do what's right," Carter continued, his voice weighed down with the burden of his confession. "But the pressure from above is too great." His eyes shifted towards Lydia, almost as if silently imploring her to understand that even those within the force were trapped in a web they could not escape. The ideal of justice had been tainted by the control of power and relationships, leaving every honest attempt at integrity crushed underfoot. Carter's testimony not only stunned the audience, but also served as a wake-up call, sparking a rising anger in their hearts. They could no longer tolerate the fact that the system had shielded people like Vanessa, despite her blatantly obvious wrongdoings. But at the same time, his words also ignited a glimmer of hope, a hope that in the end, the truth would come to light. That despite the pressure from above, there were still those willing to stand up and speak the truth when so many others had remained silent. The room was filled with a collective breath held in anticipation as anger and hope mingled, creating a palpable tension that could not be extinguished. What Sergeant Carter had just revealed was not only a revelation about the system's failures, but also a call to action, an urgent plea for change. The story was far from over, and everyone in that room knew they were witnessing a pivotal moment in history. A turning point where justice might finally be served, no matter how many obstacles stood in the way. Vanessa sat in the waiting room, her hands trembling lightly, not from the cold, but from the rising anxiety that gripped her heart. She stared intently at the table in front of her, her fingers clenched together as though trying to hold on to something, anything. Even though she knew that nothing could be controlled in this moment, each passing second felt like an eternity, a torment she had never felt before, as an unsettling fear like a ghost began to haunt her, pulling her back into dark memories she could not escape. She remembered the first time she donned the police uniform, the pride and idealism swelling inside her. She told herself she would protect the vulnerable, that she would be the defender of justice, facing off against the wrongdoers and keeping society safe. But then, like a shadow creeping into the light, she recalled the first time she bent the law, an innocent man begging for mercy when she arrested him, his eyes filled with desperation, nowhere to turn. And then Vanessa laughed. She laughed as she shoved him to the ground, not out of disdain, but because she believed she had the right to do so. The sensation of power, the feeling of superiority over someone weaker, changed her. It destroyed the idealism she once held so dear. She didn't realize that in that moment, she lost the very person she had hoped to become. In the courtroom, as the trial continued, Lawyer Paul could no longer bear the weight of what was unfolding. He stood up, his face flushed with anger, pointing directly at Vanessa, shouting, "Can't you see this case is falling apart?" His words struck like a knife, sending a jolt through Vanessa, causing her to flinch. Her mind spun, unable to separate what was happening in the courtroom from the actions she had taken in the past. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every video was slowly dismantling the facade she had carefully built over the years. What she had hidden for so long was now exposed, and there was no turning back. She stood silent, her eyes vacant, as if she no longer recognized herself. This was the first time she felt powerless. The people she had once imposed fear upon were now returning to haunt her like ghosts from the past, creeping into her every thought. Those memories, the wrong decisions she had made, now chased her like wolves snarling at her heels. Vanessa once thought she could control everything, but now she saw the truth. It was the system that controlled her, molding her into a part of it. And now, the price she had to pay was the loss of everything she once held dear. The night before the verdict was to be delivered, Vanessa sat alone in the dark room, her police badge clutched tightly in her hand. Her fingers wrapped around the badge as if she were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. But she wasn't crying out of regret. She cried because she realized she had lost herself. The ideals, the beliefs she once had when she wore that uniform, had been corrupted by the very system she had served. She recalled the ideals of justice, of fairness, that she had believed in when she first entered the police force. But now, everything had crumbled. Vanessa was no longer a defender of justice. She was just another cog in a broken machine, operated by powers greater than herself, relationships that she could not contact. And now, standing amidst the wreckage, she realized that she no longer knew who she was. The sense of loss, the sense of failure, was like a deep wound in her heart that could never heal. She cried not because of the injustices she had caused, but because she realized that she had become a part of it, an essential piece of the system she had once tried to stand against. The jury sat in the small room, the dim yellow light casting shadows over tired faces, each one reflecting a complex blend of emotions. The debate had gone on for far too long, and the tension in the air felt as if it could be touched. Words had grown sharper, their edges so taut that they seemed capable of slicing through the thick, heavy atmosphere. In the room, a mother, her eyes red and her face full of pain, could no longer hold back her tears as she thought of Malik. He was just a young man, she sobbed, and his mother only wanted to protect her son. Why was he treated like this when there was no clear reason? She paused, wiping away her tears, trying to keep her composure, but the overwhelming sense of injustice and guilt continued to cling to her. Malik's story had struck her deep in the heart, making her think of her own children. The feeling of helplessness and sorrow for the mother sitting outside, watching her son suffer while unable to do anything, was something she couldn't shake, and it made her unable to remain calm. However, not everyone in the jury agreed. A middle-aged man stood up, his face thoughtful yet uncertain. "The police are only human," he said, his voice somewhat hesitant. "They have their moments of weakness too, and they have to make decisions in high-pressure situations. We can't just look at one moment and conclude that everything they did was wrong." His voice held empathy, yet the concession felt like a crack in his belief in justice, creating a gap in the debate. All eyes in the room turned toward him, and people began to respond, some confused, others eager to argue back. "She abused her power," a woman interrupted sharply. "There's no justification for what she did, no matter what the circumstances." The debate raged on, the conflicting perspectives clashing like waves crashing violently against each other. On one side were those who felt a deep sorrow for the cruelty Malik had endured, while the other clung to the theory of power dynamics and the inherent difficulty of police work. Each person had their own reasons, and every argument contained a portion of truth, but no common ground could be found. This argument was not just a dispute over who was right or wrong in this case. It was a profound moral conflict. It reflected the divisions in society about how power and the powerless should be treated. The values of justice, the protection of human rights, were being fiercely tested in this room. And the jury faced a profound question. Could they overcome these differences to deliver a fair verdict? Or would these conflicts continue to divide them until the very end? The verdict of guilty rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap, freezing the atmosphere in its wake. Vanessa, who had once walked into this room with unwavering confidence, now stood stripped of that calm facade. Her legs gave way beneath her, trembling with disbelief. She collapsed into her chair, clutching her face in her hands as if she couldn't comprehend the words she had just heard. "It can't be," she choked out, her voice breaking, as though the sentence had torn her from reality, thrusting her into a dark space she had never imagined. The sensation was like the world crumbling beneath her feet. Everything she had done, every layer of protection she had believed was unbreakable, now lay in ruins, irreparable. Her lawyer stood beside her, his gaze filled with disappointment and helplessness. "We can appeal," he whispered, grasping for a shred of hope, though he knew it was as fragile as a thread. He wanted to tell Vanessa that it wasn't over, that there was still a chance. But deep down, He understood the truth, that this battle was lost. Everything that had transpired during the trial had exposed the truth, and no appeal could undo what had been laid bare. Vanessa sat there, her head bowed, tears silently falling into her hands. Not out of regret, but because she realized that she had become a part of the very system that had destroyed her life. The feeling of loss spread through her. But it wasn't just the loss of the verdict. It was the realization that the ideals she once believed in, the values she thought she was protecting, had been completely corrupted. She was no longer the police officer standing for justice. She was a figure exposed, a person who had betrayed the very principles she once vowed to uphold. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, every sound now muted by Vanessa's collapse. Those who witnessed it, from the audience in the courtroom to the jury, understood that this moment was not only the end of a trial, but the end of a person they had once thought untouchable. The weight of that realization hung in the air, palpable and suffocating, as the room absorbed the truth of her downfall. The illusion had shattered, and in that moment, Vanessa was no longer a symbol of authority, but a symbol of failure, both personal and institutional. Lydia rose from her seat, the wooden gavel in her hand a symbol of unwavering resolve. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her, waiting for the words of the sentence. Knowing that this moment would be pivotal, she scanned the crowd, each face in the courtroom a reflection of complex emotions, rage, hope, and anxiety about what the outcome would bring. Lydia did not rush. She stood still, her posture dignified, as if time had frozen within the walls of the courtroom. There was only her and the words she was about to speak. "This system is not perfect," Lydia began, her voice deep and assured. "But today, it has spoken for those who have no voice." Her words landed like a powerful statement, a reminder that while the system may not be flawless, in this moment, justice had prevailed. It had brought fairness to Malik, to his mother, and to all those who had been forsaken by an unjust system. She turned her gaze toward Vanessa, her eyes sharp as a blade, unwavering and resolute. "You chose power over justice." The sentence was not just a statement. It was a clear message to everyone in the room. Vanessa, who had abused her power, who had turned the justice system into a tool for personal gain, was now forced to confront the truth. In Lydia's eyes, Vanessa was no longer a police officer, no longer someone who protected justice. She was a traitor, a person who had abandoned everything that justice stood for. Lydia paused, allowing her words to sink deep into everyone present. "Today, justice is not just a victory for Malik," she continued. "It is a victory for all those who have suffered injustice, who have been victims of abuse of power, and for all those who have been silenced." Her judgment was not just a verdict for Vanessa. It was a reminder that justice could still be served, no matter the difficulties or obstacles ahead. For Malik, these words were like a bright ray of hope in the midst of a long, dark night. In that moment, he no longer felt alone, as if the pain he had endured, the years of living in fear, had finally found some purpose. Justice had spoken, and while it could not undo the past, at least it had brought peace to his soul. Malik stepped back into the garage, his hands once more familiar with the wrenches and tools. But today, they were not just instruments for fixing broken cars. For him, they had become symbols of resurrection, of beginning anew after everything he had endured. He stood there in the familiar space filled with old vehicles, his gaze distant as though reflecting on all that had transpired. A part of him felt like everything had ended, but another part of him knew this was just the beginning. He could feel the change, not only in his life, but in the community, in the people around him. He turned to look at Ella Laner, his mother, who had always been by his side, a steady rock throughout this arduous journey. "I won't let them win," Malik said, his voice low and filled with determination. These words were not just a promise to his mother, but also a vow to himself, to all the victims of injustice. He knew he couldn't change the past, but at least he could make the future better. No one could trample on his dreams anymore, and no one could silence him in the face of the truth. Outside the garage, the community began to rally, using Malik's case as a spark to ignite hope and call for reform. People from all walks of life, activists and everyday citizens who had fought for justice, began to rise together. They were not just fighting for one individual, but for all those who had been pushed to the margins of society, for all those who had endured discrimination and injustice. This case was not just a legal victory. It was a social revolution, a resounding call that it was time for change. Raised banners, slogans calling for reform, all stood as a reminder that justice could not be ignored. Malik stood in the garage, feeling the power of the community, of those who had supported him through this battle. It felt as though he was no longer alone, as though he had rediscovered the purpose of his life. And in that moment, he realized that his life had not been saved solely by the law, but by the solidarity and unwavering determination of the people around him. The strength of their unity had been the true force that had carried him forward. And it was this collective power that gave him hope for a future that was not just his own, but one where justice could finally thrive. Vanessa walked into the prison, the coldness enveloping her like a heavy cloak. She was no longer the powerful police officer, no longer the enforcer of justice. Now, she was just a prisoner, a person condemned by the very system she had once served. The sound of the heavy iron door slamming shut behind her echoed in the silence, and immediately the sharp, calculating gazes of the other inmates turned toward her. The air was thick with derisive comments, each one a sharp blade to her already wounded pride. "How's the cop life now?" A voice from the corner sneered, laced with mockery and disdain. The question hit Vanessa like a slap to the face, making her feel as if she had been reduced to something unrecognizable, a person with no worth left to be measured. The unrelenting stares from the inmates, filled with contempt, made her shrink, her shoulders sagging as though she wished she could disappear into herself. She had once held the power in her hands, the ability to command and control others, but now she was the weakest person in the room. The helplessness that she had never known before now crashed over her like a massive wave, making her feel as though she was no longer the person she had once been. Memories of the times she had abused her power, the times she had trampled on justice, came flooding back like ghosts haunting her with every breath. Vanessa curled into herself within the confined space of the prison, feeling the crushing weight of the helplessness, the very thing she had imposed on so many others, now haunting her in return. With every step through the prison, every mocking laugh from the inmates, the cruel reality of the system she had been part of became clearer. Vanessa was no longer the strong, confident woman she once was. She was now someone abandoned, someone who had allowed justice to slip through her fingers, facing the punishment for her actions. Everything she had done had come back to her with an overwhelming force, one that she couldn't fight, couldn't escape. The system that had once been her tool was now the one that was slowly consuming her, and the truth of that weighed heavily on her soul. Lydia stood before the statue of justice, the soft glow of the sunset casting a long shadow across her figure, creating an image that was both striking and solemn, like a warrior standing between the world and the truth. Her eyes remained fixed on the statue, on the symbol of the values she had dedicated her life to pursuing. But in that moment, despite the statue's unwavering strength, her heart was heavy with doubt and reflection. "One small step, but still not enough," Lydia whispered, her voice gentle but resolute. The words seemed like a quiet self-reflection, a recognition that although there had been a victory, though the case had ended with a verdict, true justice had not yet fully prevailed. She understood that a single successful case could not erase the cracks in the system, could not heal the wounds society still bore. One person had been held accountable, but how many others, how many more stories, remained unheard, still waiting for justice to be done? The shadow of Lydia blended into the fading light of the evening, the last rays of the day slowly dimming, creating an atmosphere that was both reverent and melancholic. In this moment, Lydia questioned, "Has justice truly won?" This question was not just about the case she had just presided over, but about the entire system she served. Standing there before the statue, Lydia knew that justice was not something easily attained, nor was it always perfectly achievable. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Justice might win in moments, but did it have the power to change the system as a whole? Lydia knew that despite having done everything in her power, despite the victory, there were still too many battles left to fight, too many injustices still untouched. But she did not give up. Even if it was just a small step, she would continue forward. Because justice, no matter how difficult, was the path she had chosen. And even if it wasn't enough yet, she still believed that one day it would prevail. And that is the story of Malik, of Vanessa, and of the ongoing struggles within our society. A story about justice, injustice, and hopes that never fade. In the end, Malik found his strength again, and Vanessa had to face the consequences of the actions she had caused. But in every story, whether it is one of victory or defeat, we see that justice is a journey that never truly ends. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional and thought-provoking story from the Emotional Journey channel. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful narratives that inspire and move people. We also encourage you to share this video with your friends and family. You never know whose life might be changed by hearing the right story at the right time. A single story can spark hope, shift perspectives, and bring comfort to someone in need. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. We truly appreciate you, and we can't wait to bring you more incredible stories in the next